No island in the entire Caribbean changed hands more times than Tobago. Dutch, Courlander, English, French. Back and forth, over 30 times, across 2.5 centuries. Most of those powers brought enslaved Africans with them when they came, each one drawing from different ports, different networks, sometimes different continents entirely, before the people they enslaved ever set foot on Tobago at all. Which means Tobago's African roots aren't one story. There's several competing colonial stories, layered on top of each other. And one of them starts with a nation almost nobody outside of specialist history circles has ever heard of. Every island we've covered so far in this series has one thing in common: a single dominant colonial power, buying from a fairly consistent set of African ports over a long, mostly continuous stretch of time. Jamaica had Britain, buying heavily from the Gold Coast for over a century. Barbados had Britain too, with its own distinct, heavily documented connection to the Bight of Biafra. Trinidad, though it arrived late to the plantation system, still had one clear colonial administration keeping records by the time its population was largely formed. Tobago breaks that pattern completely, and it breaks it early. From the 1620s onward, this small island became one of the most fought-over pieces of territory in the entire Western Hemisphere, claimed and reclaimed by 4 different European powers before Britain finally secured it for good in 1763. Some of those powers held the island for less than a decade before losing it again. Some lost it and came back to try a second, third, even fourth time. That constant turnover means Tobago's African population wasn't assembled by one trading network buying from one set of ports. The way Jamaica's or Barbados's was, it was built in overlapping, sometimes contradictory waves by completely different Europeans, using completely different African trade relationships, sometimes using routes that didn't even run directly from Africa to Tobago at all. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Tobago's African roots can't be reduced to a single tribe or a single clean percentage the way we've managed for some of the other islands in this series, and why that complexity is, itself, the real story worth telling. The first Europeans to bring enslaved Africans to Tobago in any real sustained numbers weren't Dutch, and they weren't British. They were Courlanders, from the Duchy of Courland, a small Baltic state occupying part of what is now Latvia, ruled at the time by Duke Jacob Kettler. Courland was, on paper, an unlikely colonial power. It was itself a vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with a total population of only around 200,000 people, dwarfed by the empires it was attempting to compete with in the Caribbean. But under Duke Jacob, Courland built one of the largest merchant fleets in Europe relative to its size, and used that fleet to establish its own trading posts, directly on the West African coast. That direct African connection let Courland bring captives straight to its Tobago settlement starting in the 1640s, without needing to go through any other European intermediary. It's one of the strangest footnotes in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. A tiny Baltic duchy, answerable to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, running its own independent African trading operation an ocean away, to supply a small Caribbean sugar colony that most of its own citizens back home in the Baltic almost certainly never knew existed. The Dutch arrived in the same general period, locked in near-constant rivalry with the Courlanders for control of the island, and their own route into Tobago's African population took an even more unusual detour. After Portuguese forces expelled Dutch colonists from their territory in Brazil, those Dutch settlers relocated to Tobago and brought a portion of their existing enslaved labor force along with them, from Brazil, not directly from Africa, which means some of the earliest African ancestry recorded in Tobago's colonial population may have already crossed the Atlantic once before. arriving in Tobago secondhand from a completely different American colony. Rather than coming straight from an African port, the way most of the enslaved population on neighboring islands did. By 1660, the Dutch settlement on Tobago, known as New Walcheren, recorded a population of roughly 1,500 European colonists and 7,000 enslaved Africans, an extraordinary ratio for such an early date, on an island that had barely seen sustained European settlement a few decades earlier. The scale of that enslaved population, relative to the size of the colony itself, tells you how central forced African labor was to Tobago's economy from nearly the very beginning of its colonial existence, regardless of which flag happened to be flying over it in any given year. Britain didn't gain lasting, secure control of Tobago until 1763, seizing it from France as part of the same treaty that also brought St. Vincent, Grenada, and Dominica under British rule for the first time. That's nearly a full century after Jamaica had already become a massive established British sugar colony, and decades after Barbados had already built the core of its plantation economy. Tobago's British-era slave trade was, by comparison, a late and heavily compressed chapter, layered directly on top of over 100 years of earlier Dutch and Courlander importation that had already shaped the island before Britain ever secured it permanently. Even after 1763, Tobago's colonial status didn't fully stabilize. France recaptured the island in 1781, Britain took it back in 1793, France reclaimed it again in 1802, and Britain finally recaptured it for good in 1803, keeping it until independence in 1962. Layer that instability on top of the Dutch and Courlander period that came before it, and you get a population history unlike anything else in this series. At least 4 distinct colonial administrations, each with its own trading connections, each contributing enslaved Africans to the island at different points across more than 2 centuries. Historians studying the resulting population have documented enslaved communities in Tobago, drawing broadly from the Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, and Congo peoples, alongside Mandinka arrivals from further north and west along the coast, a mix reflecting the overlapping trading connections of literally every European power that had controlled the island at one point or another during its colonial history. One honest note, and it's an especially important one for this particular video. Unlike Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, where we've been able to point to a detailed mitochondrial DNA study, a 2-century shipping ledger, or a single-year census breaking the population down region by region with hard numbers, Tobago doesn't have an equivalent surviving record at that same level of detail. Historians who specialize in Tobago's specific history have said plainly, in their own published work, that the written sources here are either inaccurate or incomplete. We can trace the roots, the powers, and the approximate timelines that brought people to the island with real confidence. We cannot yet give you the same kind of precise percentage breakdown we were able to give you for Tobago's neighbors, and we'd rather tell you that honestly than manufacture a number that doesn't actually exist in the historical record. What the record does preserve, in vivid and specific detail, is what the people brought to Tobago under all of these overlapping colonial powers actually did once they got there. In November 1770, on the Courland estate, land still carrying the name of the Baltic duchy that had helped found the island's slave-based economy over a century earlier, an enslaved man remembered by history only as Sandy led the first documented slave revolt in Tobago's entire recorded history. One surviving account describes him as a young African chief, captured by a rival and sold into slavery, brought across the Atlantic to Tobago, and purchased there by a planter named Samuel Hall. Colonial correspondence from the time describes the uprising's suppression in blunt, brutal terms. Most of the rebels killed, hanged, or burned, with the surviving letters more concerned with reassuring nervous planters on other islands than with recording any detail about who these people actually were before their capture. Sandy's rebellion wasn't an isolated incident, and it wasn't quickly forgotten by the people who came after him. Within 4 years, 2 more large-scale revolts followed on the same small island, Bloody Bay in 1771 and Queens Bay in 1774. 3 major uprisings in less than 5 years on an island that European powers had spent over a century fighting each other just to control. Whatever specific African nations these individuals came from, whatever specific ports their ships had left from, whether they'd crossed the Atlantic once directly or twice by way of Brazil, the record leaves absolutely no doubt about what kind of organized resistance they were capable of the moment they arrived. Tobago's African story doesn't fit neatly into the same format as the other islands in this series, and that's not a gap in our research. It's an accurate reflection of what actually happened here. No other Caribbean island was claimed, lost, and reclaimed by as many competing European powers, and no other island's enslaved population was assembled from as many different, overlapping colonial trading networks. Some of them routed through an entirely different American colony before ever reaching Tobago's shores at all. If you're of Tobagonian descent, your ancestry may not trace back through one clean historical thread the way we've been able to show for Jamaica or Barbados in earlier videos. It may run through Dutch traders who first passed through Brazil, or through a tiny Baltic duchy most people have never once heard of, or through the wave of British trading that only arrived a full century after the island's plantation economy had already begun under other flags entirely. All of those threads are real. None of them cancel the others out, and all of them are still, in some form, waiting in an archive somewhere to be connected to a specific family. That's exactly the gap we built our surname and record research service to help close. If your family history runs through Tobago, or through any of the islands we've covered in this series, and you want to go deeper than what a single video can cover, the link is pinned in the comments below. Our research service goes directly into surviving colonial records, parish registers, and plantation archives, wherever they exist for your specific surname and parish, to see what can actually be documented about your family's history, not just the general pattern for your island as a whole. Given everything we just covered about how incomplete Tobago's written record can be compared to its neighbors, we'll always tell you honestly what the archive does and doesn't support for your specific name. The same way we've tried to be honest with you throughout this entire video. We've now covered 5 islands in this series, and Tobago is the first where the historical record itself couldn't give us one single clean answer. If you know of a specific study or archive on Tobago's African origins that could help fill in what we couldn't find here, tell us in the comments, and we'll go looking. And if uncovering the real, documented history hidden inside the African and Caribbean diaspora matters to you, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do.